What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. This is pros and cons for the Cricket Ovation 2. In this video, I'm going to be going over some of the strengths and weaknesses of this phone. Now, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps out the channel a lot. But with that being said, let's get into the video. So my first pro for this phone is the ultra-wide camera. Now, I know the ultra-wide camera isn't exactly uncommon. In fact, it's pretty much the opposite. Lots of phones have it, but unfortunately, a lot of the lower end phones don't have ultra-wide cameras. And usually instead, if they have anything besides just a standard camera and a depth sensing camera for portrait mode, it ends up being a macro camera, which, don't get me wrong, I can see a reason why some people might like the macro camera, but I personally think an ultra-wide camera has so many more uses. You can take pictures of a larger room, a large object, scenery, group photos. The list really goes on. So many different uses for an ultra-wide camera, whereas with a macro camera, what can you really do? Take a super close-up picture of a random object. I mean, if you're really into photography, a macro camera might be useful once in a while, but how often are you really going to use that type of feature? Whereas with an ultra-wide camera, there's really no end to the amount of uses you can have for it. So I personally think an ultra-wide camera is so much more useful, and because of that, I think it's a real nice thing that this phone has one. My second pro for this phone is the large display. Now, you've probably noticed this is a pretty large phone at 6.82 inches. It's definitely on the high end as far as size goes. This is going to be great for content consumption. So if you're streaming videos, playing a game, viewing photos, even reading, pretty much anything you do on the phone is going to show up much larger on a display like this, as opposed to something tiny like the iPhone 12 mini. So at the end of the day, having a display is almost always good. And the reason I say almost always is there are some phones out there that may have super large displays but are also really bulky, making them uncomfortable to hold and even more uncomfortable to carry in your pocket. But with this phone, we have a nice slim design, so it's really easy to hold, and you can put it in your pocket without even realizing it's there. So you get all the benefits of having a large display, but you don't have to deal with the downsides. My third pro for this phone is the fingerprint sensor. Kind of like the ultra-wide camera, that's not exactly an uncommon feature, but it is a nice thing to have considering that lots of phones in this entry-level price range don't have a fingerprint scanner or face unlock, so you have to use a PIN or a pattern or a password, none of which is exactly convenient. So having a fingerprint scanner that's so easy to use right here on the back, just tap it and the phone is going to unlock. And let's try that one more time. It's so nice to have this. You can unlock your phone so much faster, so much more convenient than typing in a PIN. Now, unfortunately, this phone does not have face unlock, but I personally think a fingerprint scanner is a little bit more useful just because you don't have to take your phone out and look at it in order to use it. So overall, even though we only have a fingerprint scanner and not both a fingerprint scanner and face unlock, I still think it's a win with this phone. My fourth pro for this phone is that it has Android 11. Now, I know what you're thinking. Android 11 is basically just the current software we're on, but in this price range, a lot of phones actually don't have Android 11, and you're stuck with Android 10. For example, most of the blue phones that are being made today still have Android 10, and while that's not exactly a bad software, it's still kind of a disappointment not to have the newest version of Android. Once Android 12 becomes the norm, this isn't really going to be that much of an advantage for this phone anymore, but again, it is a really entry-level phone, so seeing that it has a newer version of Android is a nice thing. My fifth pro for this phone is the design. Like I said before, it's really nice that this phone has a nice sleek design that makes it easy and comfortable to hold in your hand and carry in your pocket. And the other thing I like about it is just the general look. Don't get me wrong, it does have its shortcomings and little design flaws that just look a little bit off. Like the bezel at the bottom, I'm not a big fan of this look. In the water drop notch front facing camera, I do think a hole punch looks so much nicer, and I wish that every phone would have one. But overall, the phone does have thin bezels on the sides and a generally nice modern look. So now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's go over some of the not so good things. My first con for this phone is, like I said before, no face unlock. Now, it's not a huge loss to not have Face Unlock since we do have a really good fingerprint scanner, but at the same time, having two options is always nice. And while not every phone at this price range has both options, just imagine if you're in a situation where maybe your hand's dirty, you're wearing a glove, whatever, having Face Unlock would be nice so you don't absolutely have to put in a PIN. My second con for this phone is the processor. This phone is getting 3 GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A22 processor. Now the RAM isn't that bad, 3 GB is pretty standard for a phone in this price range, but I ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on the phone, and it came back with a single core score of 149 and a multi-core score of 453. Now this is not very strong at all. If you're hoping to do anything besides basic tasks, you're probably going to be in for a little bit of a disappointment, because if you're trying to do anything really high-end on this phone, it's going to struggle a lot. Now the phone will be good for basic tasks like sending texts, making calls, browsing the web a little, maybe some light social media use, and then of course streaming videos. That's gonna be perfectly fine. But if you're trying to do any type of mobile gaming, especially stuff with more complex graphics, or video editing or something like that that just takes more processing power, this phone's probably not gonna handle it too well. My third con for this phone is the battery. This phone has a 3900 milliamp hour battery, and while that's not the worst in the world, there are plenty out there that are much worse than this. I've seen plenty of entry-level phones that have much bigger batteries than this, and since this phone doesn't have a very strong processor to make up for it, I feel like it's just a lose in both categories. And if you care about either the battery or the processor, you can do so much better. My fourth con for this phone is that there's no NFC. In case you don't know what NFC is the technology behind contactless mobile payment services like Google Pay and Samsung Pay. And without NFC, you can't use those services. So if you want to use Google Pay and you have this phone, it's not even going to be an option and you're going to miss out. Since these services are becoming more and more widely used and a lot more popular these days, I feel like every phone should have it. So unfortunately, this phone doesn't. And since I use those features all the time, that's a big con for me. My fifth and final con for this phone is the storage. This phone is getting 32 GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion. Now, I know you can put photos and videos on a microSD card, but since pretty much every Android phone there is, except maybe some of the really high-end flagship phones, besides those phones, pretty much every Android phone is going to have microSD card expansion, so I barely even count that. I mean, for me personally, I like to keep everything on the actual device itself. For simplicity's sake, I never use a microSD card anyway, and it honestly is kind of a pain to have to. So to only have 32 GB of internal storage in this day and age, with all the apps in the system even just getting larger and larger, 32 GB is really not a whole lot. And if you do anything more than just basic activities, you're gonna run out of space real quick. Even if you like to take photos and shoot videos, maybe you even just have a lot of text or something that you don't want to delete. There's so many things that can easily take up a lot of storage that I feel like 64 is the minimum that any phone should have. 32 just isn't enough. For the average user, if you really watch what you put on your phone, then maybe it'll be okay. But if you're anything close to a power user, you definitely should consider getting a phone with more storage. The other thing that makes this so much of a con is that plenty of phones in this price range have way more storage than this. For example, pretty much every Blue phone that exists has at least 64 GB, and I've seen a couple phones, not a ton, but a couple, that have 128 that really aren't much more expensive than this phone. So if you can see yourself in a situation where storage is really gonna matter, then I would suggest looking at other options that have more storage. But those were my pros and cons for the Cricket Ovation 2. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. But that's it for this video. As always, I will see you guys in the next one.